welcome to Hanna's Labyrinth, the podcast where Hanna discusses character psychology, visual intrigue, and music. This is week 2 of the podcast, and this week I chose to watch Squid Game. For those that don't know, Squid Game is the number 1 trending, most watched show on Netflix right now, and it's a Korean show about hundreds of people that are congregated for being down in their luck and voluntarily choose to join a Battle Royale Hunger Games style game where they are promised a big sum of money at the end. In this game, they live in a big warehouse with bunk beds, and they play various Korean children's games, all in the pursuit of the big cash prize, which all of the contestants are very desperate for, as they were chosen for being down on their luck. For this week of the podcast, I thought I would just talk about episode 1 and about gambling addiction, because I feel like our main character, Gi-Hun, clearly has a gambling problem that we should acknowledge. For Labyrinth on Instagram to get visuals on what I'm talking about. But before that, some general thoughts. Thought 1, I thought that Squid Game was very well filmed and executed. First of all, the show looks great, and second of all, it's very binge-worthy, and all the episodes end on a cliffhanger. So if you haven't checked it out, definitely go do that. You won't stop. And it's only, I believe it was 8 episodes, so go do that. Second of all, I like that they used a bunch of children's games as the challenges that would allow these players to win a big sum of money. I find it interesting because A, they're games I don't know, and B, it's a great metaphor on returning to the simple and more primitive human nature. And third, I am just wondering why Squid Game is so popular. And this isn't to say that's bad in any way. I'm just curious because there is a lot of gruesomeness in the show and a lot of death. And I feel like in a time of a pandemic, that's not something you would want to keep your mind on. But Among Us was popular last winter, and that involved a lot of death and deception. So that makes me wonder, and I'll let you guys think about that. And without further ado, I'd like to get into the main topic of this week's podcast episode on Squid Game, episode 1, and that is going to be gambling addiction in our main character, Gi-Hun. To keep this organized, I think I'll just give you an overview of gambling addiction, and we'll go on from there. To start, I'm just going to give the definition of a gambling disorder from the psychiatry.org website. And I quote, "Gambling or disorder involves repeated problem gambling behavior. The behavior leads to problems for the individual, families, and society. Adults and adolescents with gambling disorder have trouble controlling their gambling. They will continue to even when it causes significant problems." End quote. I think this is a very good, broad, and general overview of what a gambling disorder is, because it does mention the impacts of this. And these impacts can be seen in Gi-Hun, who in the first 5 minutes of the show, forgets his daughter's birthday and steals from his mother, which are both 2 very egocentric moves, because the only thing on his mind is gambling again. I think it's also important to point out that it wasn't until the 1980s that gambling was labeled by the psychiatric community as more of a addiction rather than just a compulsion that people seek just to relieve anxiety and such. The new labeling as an addiction means that there are chemical changes in the brain, such as increased levels of dopamine, which is the brain's reward system. Gambling does not involve injecting any drugs that put chemicals that mimic dopamine and such. Instead, there's a natural release of dopamine. It functions much like an addiction in that, since your body produces more, you will eventually build a tolerance to the same level of dopamine being released. Thus, you will chase more and more dopamine, bigger and bigger gambles, in order to reach the same high of winning. Gambling isn't usually a big topic that's talked about, just because it's not technically a drug and it's all natural in a sense. I wanted to point out that gambling is the most common impulse disorder worldwide, and an estimated 80% of gambling addicts never seek treatment, and 75% of those that do will return back to a casino to gamble. Thus, awareness is very important. But since gambling has been classified as more of an addiction now, is being treated as such. So that means with pharmaceuticals that could either sit in the place of those dopamine receptors, blocking those dopamine receptors from taking in the dopamine that the body produces when gambling. In addition to self-reflection and getting a patient to understand why they gamble and acknowledging that it is a problem. Because one of the main consequences of gambling is that one loses sight of statistical chances of winning because they're simply chasing the thrill of winning and receiving that dopamine boost. This is known as a sunk cost fallacy in economics. And the sunk cost fallacy basically means that after a person has invested a certain amount of time, money, or any other resource, a person usually continues to keep playing until they've recovered at least some of the funds because they feel that they've already invested so much. And statistically, maybe it'll work out in their favor. Unfortunately, statistics does not work that way, and probability means that each individual time you play, the statistics are the same, and each round is independent of each other. And this is actually backed up by science and brain scans. So brain scans have shown that in gambling addicts, there is lower electrical activity in the prefrontal area of the brain, which is the risk assessment area, instinct suppression zone of the brain, which is where one would assess risk, obviously, and suppress those impulses to go gamble again. So gambles such as lottery tickets or just going to the casino and Squid Game, they heavily prey on human biology, and though effective ways to make money, are they moral? ? I will leave that question to you. And before I get back to the examples from Squid Game, I will read you this fancy quote I found from Dr. Timothy Fong, addiction expert and co-director of the UCLA Gambling Studies program. Open quote, "Without a doubt, we know it's an actual brain disease." It's talking about gambling addiction. That's very different from 20 years ago when people saw it as an issue of morality and greed and lack of willpower. There are brain changes that explain why people can't stop. So with that out of the way, I think I'll get back to Squid Game. And things that I noticed most in the first episode in our main character Gi-Hun is that A, our main character seems very egocentric and only looking out for himself. And B, Gi-Hun, whenever he gambles and loses, he's very depressed but also very eager to play again until he wins. And whenever he does win, he feels like he was chosen by God and has a big celebration. So this ties back to the sunk cost fallacy, which I will talk about later, I suppose. But first, the examples of egocentrism, which is a big proponent of gambling addiction, because when you are addicted to something, the most important thing in life is not the people around you or how you affect them, but you and you only usually. Even in the first 5 minutes of the show, it's shown that Gi-Hun, A, forgot his daughter's birthday, and B, is willing to steal his own mother's credit card and withdraw money from it without her consent. So in the first 5 minutes, it's shown that Gi-Hun is at the point where he betrays and forgets family without any thought because he is the most important person in his world. And this may not be entirely his fault because when you are addicted to something, usually you're going to be chasing whatever that is. I think this example of egocentrism is a good connection to Piaget's theory of cognitive development. So a general summary of Piaget's theory of cognitive development, which you can think of as checkpoints in a child's development as they try to navigate and make sense of the world, in which they usually do such in schema, which are brain shortcuts in a way. There are only 4 stages to Piaget's stages of cognitive development, and they are in order from small child to ages 12 plus. Sensorimotor, which is from ages 0 to 2. This is when a child learns by touching and feeling, and they eventually develop object permanence, which is when you know that an object is there even when you're not looking at it. And then the second stage, usually from ages 2 to 7, is the pre-operational stage. And this is when a child usually learns that symbols usually have a meaning. But even though a child is acknowledging that symbols have meaning that are beyond themselves, at this stage, children are usually still very egocentric, and I've brought that word up before just a few minutes ago. And egocentric basically means unable to see things from another person's point of view. And though I don't think Gi-Hun is incapable of doing that, seeing how his actions affect others from their point of view and how he may be a detriment to his life, I think that his need for gambling and getting out of his immense debt has clouded his judgment and made it so that all he cares about is himself and getting out of debt. And since there are only 2 more stages of the cognitive development theory, I figure I might as well go back, and then we can circle back to the pre-operational stage in egocentrism. The third stage from ages 7 to 11 is called the concrete operational stage, and this is when a child learns about cause and effect. And then the last stage is from ages 12 and older, known as formal operations. This is when a child or adult is able to think abstractly and go beyond what they're told, to consolidate information and use deductive reasoning and other forms of logic to create their own solutions to things. So, going back to pre-operational stage, which is usually from ages 2 to 7, when children understand that symbols and actions have meaning, but are unable to view things from other people's points of view. I think Gi-Hun is showing this childlike cognitive ability because many of the things he does do seem very childish. For example, in the beginning, when he asks his mother for money and she says no, he grunts and he's almost whining that he should deserve more money just by virtue of being her son. And as I mentioned, stealing from his mom without a second thought, that's another egocentric moment, because most adults Gi-Hun's age know that stealing is wrong, especially from your mother, who you live with and cooks for you. But one could argue that this isn't Gi-Hun thinking, this is the addiction thinking for him. And now I'll move on to point B, which is about how Gi-Hun's dramatic responses to either winning or losing. Again, the examples are very early on and in the first 5 minutes. So the first example that I could think of is when Gi-Hun goes to the money machine and tries to guess the password to his mom's credit card. When he sees that she's changed the credit card number, he gets a little tense and he starts panicking, and he keeps on guessing, even though he knows that if he guesses too many times, that the card will get locked. He makes a few wrong attempts, and each time he gets frustrated and angry with the machine, but he keeps on trying to guess, even though he doesn't really have a clue on what his mom might put as the password. All he's really going off of is that her old password was his birthday. Though he does eventually guess that the password is his daughter's birthday, it does take him a while, and his mood immediately changes. He goes from very sad and very lost to very excited, jumping around and celebrating with a friend who's nearby. After he gets the money, he immediately goes to gamble on some horses, where the same thing happens again. His first round he loses, and he's very sad about that, but then he goes to play again, because sunk cost fallacy, lack of judgment of his chances of winning. But he does happen to win this time, as he chooses numbers 6 and 8, which are the month and date of his daughter's birthday. So again, even though this isn't really an achievement of skill, we see Gi-Hun jumping around again when he wins, jumping on other people and running to the cash out lady. His spirits are so high that when he gets the money, he even gives the lady an 100,000 bill, which he eventually goes back for again because he gets pickpocketed and he is desperate for money. The next example that I can think of is when he meets the man in the train station that sort of recruits him for the Squid Game, where he plays a Korean game with a strange man in a suit, offers him a sum of $100,000 if he beats him. And even though the consequence of losing is only a slap on the face, Gi-Hun plays likely a dozen times and loses. And despite that, he is very excited when he wins, and his mood is completely flipped around. He goes from sad man who has slap marks on his face to rejuvenated in a way, and almost like he wasn't slapped a dozen times for losing, since he got the money and he's good. This change in mood is also noticeable to other people, such as the mother of the friend he visits even asks him how much he's had to drink that night, even though he's had nothing. And he's just very happy from winning the money. And this example is shown one more time at the crane machine when he continues to play a crane game to get a stuffed animal, even though he keeps losing and not improving in the game. You can also see whenever he's playing, he doesn't have the most focus per se. He's very tense and he's very desperate to get the toy inside the crane game. So this is a good example of showing that no matter how small the stakes are for a gambler such as Gi-Hun, even small things like competitions and gambles, he feels an obligation to conquer and dominate. And again, it's not until a child shows him how to play the game and win that he finally wins. And when he does get a box from the crane game, again, he has a very big celebration. He even picks up the child and jumps around, something that adults usually don't do. And that leaves us into just before Gi-Hun actually goes into the Squid Game to fight for the money. To recap, I gave an overview on gambling addiction and what it means outside of Squid Game, and also gave examples on how Squid Game portrayed Gi-Hun's gambling addiction in the form of his egocentrism and gambling mood swings. Thank you for making it to the end. It's very late at night for me, and I hope you join me next week, where I'm going to do some research on brain tumors and connect that back to Squid Game. Thank you for listening, and goodbye.